When a young man in a cafe humiliated an elderly veteran for his awards, he had no idea that his actions would lead to the most unexpected revelation that would shock the entire city. The pre-dawn light, a hesitant wash of bruised purples and soft grays, barely pierced the canyons of downtown Philadelphia. North Upper Darby Street, typically a bustling artery, held its breath, exhaling only the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional solitary taxi cutting through the stillness. On the corner, a neon sign, a beacon against the fading night, spelled out morning glory, promising comfort and warmth. The cafe was famed for its impossibly fluffy, steam-wreathed muffins and coffee so robust it could kickstart a dormant galaxy. Usually this early hour offered a rare solitude, but today a scattering of early risers already clung to their tables, lost in the quiet ritual of breakfast before the city's true awakening. Around 6 o'clock, just as the first defiant tendrils of sunlight began to gild the morning glory sign, an old man pushed open the heavy glass door. His movements, though slow, possessed an inherent, almost military precision, the unhurried grace of someone whose life had been shaped by discipline and purpose. This was Leroy Jebson, a man in his early 70s, whose sturdy frame and clear, piercing blue eyes spoke volumes of a life fully lived, deeply experienced. Despite the intricate map of wrinkles etched upon his face and his neatly trimmed silver hair, an undeniable strength resonated from him. He wore a well-worn, yet immaculately clean, navy blue blazer that hinted at a past uniform, paired with unassuming beige trousers. On his left lapel, almost swallowed by the fabric, glinted a small, tarnished medal, a distinction he wore not for show, but as a quiet, personal affirmation. Leroy rarely frequented such establishments. For the better part of 2 decades, he'd lived a quiet, solitary life in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, tending to his meticulously kept garden and occasionally sharing a rye whiskey with a handful of old army buddies. Today, however, was different. Last night, his only grandson, young Caleb, had miraculously aced his entrance exams for the University of Pennsylvania. Leroy, despite his own modest means, felt compelled to mark the occasion. Caleb had always wrestled with mathematics, his confidence often wavering, yet he had pushed through, a quiet triumph in itself. Leroy, though he seldom showed overt displays of emotion, swelled with a profound pride for his grandson. He found himself drifting back to his own youth, a time of boundless ambition and fragile hopes, remembering the daunting decisions, the paralyzing fear of missteps, and the vital comfort of unwavering support. His own father, a weathered veteran of the Great War, had always preached that true victory lay not just in achievement, but in the honest pursuit, the sincere effort. He had chosen morning glory for a specific reason. Rumor had it they baked the finest maple pecan pastries in all of Philadelphia, and Caleb, bless his heart, had an almost fanatical devotion to them. Leroy intended to surprise him, a dozen warm, fragrant pastries delivered with the morning sun, a simple gesture to underscore his boundless pride. He approached the counter, where a young woman with a meticulously applied, vibrant pink hair and an air of weary disdain stood. Her name tag, Brittany Trainee, seemed to shimmer with an ironic glow. She looked utterly exhausted. Her eyes, though heavily made up, held a vacant, irritated stare that swept over Leroy with a barely concealed sneer. Beside her, leaning casually against the counter, was a tall, self-assured young man in his mid-20s, his face shadowed by a designer stubble, his forearms adorned with intricate tattoos. This was Kevin, the shift manager. He was gesturing expansively, engrossed in some animated anecdote he was recounting to Brittany, oblivious to the presence of a customer. "Good morning," Leroy said softly, yet with a distinct clarity, attempting to draw their attention. He cleared his throat, a small, polite cough. Kevin paused his narrative, turning slowly. His gaze, laced with a casual arrogance, drifted down Leroy's form, lingering disdainfully on the worn blazer and the understated metal, as if calculating his worth, his purchasing power. "What do you want, old man?" he snapped, his tone thick with undisguised irritation. Brittany, mimicking his sneer, stifled a giggle behind her hand, her eyes sparkling with malicious amusement. Leroy chose to ignore the dismissive tone. His focus remained squarely on his mission. "I'd like a dozen of your maple pecan pastries, please, and perhaps a couple of coffees to go," he requested politely, extending a neatly folded $20 bill. Kevin snorted, a derisive sound that scraped at Leroy's composure. "Maple pecan pastries? Grandpa, are you from the last century or something? We haven't had those in ages. Sold out last night. And even if we did, you couldn't afford them anyway." He scoffed, his words laced with such open mockery that Brittany giggled again, this time more freely. The insinuation that Leroy was financially incapable was a direct jab, especially given Leroy's lifelong commitment to living within his means, never once resorting to charity. He eked out a quiet existence, but his pride, a rigid, unwavering sentinel, forbade complaint. Sold out? Leroy felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had made a special trip, driven by a simple desire to procure those specific pastries. "When will you have more?" "Never, old man. We don't bake 'em anymore." "Not profitable." Kevin shrugged, his eyes dissecting Leroy, as if searching for corroboration to his casual cruelty. He was clearly spoiling for a confrontation. Every gesture, every word saturated with contempt. He seemed to revel in the fleeting authority he held over this vulnerable, elderly man. "And anyway, can't you see? We've got a line here. Don't hold up the real customers." Leroy glanced over his shoulder. Behind him stood a single woman, perhaps in her 30s, absorbed by her laptop. She seemed utterly oblivious to their exchange, her gaze fixed on the screen. There was no cue to speak of. Kevin's lie was blatant, audacious. Leroy took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to rein in the burgeoning frustration. He abhorred conflict, especially with the young. He had always believed in the quiet wisdom of patience, the calming influence of age. "I don't see a line, and I simply wanted to inquire about the pastries," Leroy replied calmly. His voice held no anger, no trace of offense, only a weary resignation. He felt invisible, a forgotten relic, as if his very presence was an inconvenient obstruction in this bright, bustling, unforgiving modern world. Kevin smirked. "Oh, come on, Grandpa. Just leave already. You're taking up space. My morning's already ruined, and now you and your damn pastries." He waved a dismissive hand towards the exit, as if swatting away a bothersome fly. His tone was so overtly insulting that even Brittany, who had been enjoying the spectacle, visibly winced. Even she, with her casual disregard, seemed taken aback by the sheer audacity of her manager's disrespect. "I'm very sorry if I caused any inconvenience," Leroy said. His words tinged with such genuine humility, they sounded almost like an apology. He felt a sharp pang of hurt in his chest. He had merely wished to offer his grandson a small token of affection, and instead he found himself scorned and ridiculed. A flicker of profound sadness crossed his eyes. He recalled how, even in the crucible of war, amidst the raw brutality, soldiers strive to maintain a shred of humanity, a mutual respect. Here, in the tranquil calm of peacetime, in a mundane coffee shop, he was met with such blatant contempt. "Exactly, so get out. Go on, take a nap, Grandpa. It'll do you good." Kevin stepped closer, invading Leroy's personal space, his face twisted into a smug grin. He seemed to relish his perceived victory. In that moment, his gaze snagged on the modest medal pinned to Leroy's lapel. "Oh, what do we have here? A little medal? You think that's going to impress anyone? Times have changed, old man. Your war stories aren't worth a damn. Nobody wants to hear about your heroics that probably only exist in your head." Those words struck Leroy with a force far greater than any physical blow. The medal was not merely a piece of metal. It was a sacred emblem of his past, his unwavering service, his fallen comrades who had laid down their lives defending their nation. It was a tangible reminder of duty, of honor, of ultimate sacrifice. And now, this callow youth, who had likely never witnessed the true face of conflict, dared to mock it. Leroy's hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. He could not afford to stoop to this level. His principles, forged in the fires of war and tempered by a lifetime of integrity, would not allow him to descend into the mire of petty squabbles. "That medal, young man, is for service," Leroy said quietly, his voice trembling slightly, yet his dignity remained intact. "For defending this country." Yeah, sure, defender. "And I'm the President of the United States," Kevin guffawed, and Brittany, as if on cue, joined in. Their laughter echoed through the cafe, drawing the attention of other patrons. The woman with the laptop finally looked up, her gaze lingering on Leroy, then on Kevin. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a nascent flicker of disdain, crossed her features, but she quickly returned to her screen, seemingly indifferent. Leroy felt utterly humiliated. He had never encountered such flagrant disrespect. He had dedicated years to service, risked his life, witnessed unspeakable horrors. And now, his sacrifices were being trivialized, his past ridiculed. A knot tightened in his throat. He understood the futility of argument. These individuals were impervious to reason, to common decency. They saw him only as a frail, elderly man, an easy target for their casual cruelty. "Fine," Leroy whispered, offering a defeated nod before slowly turning to leave. He craved no scene, no further spectacle of his humiliation. He simply wanted to escape, to erase this vile incident from his memory. He felt the weight of several curious stares from the other patrons, who, though silent, were clearly observing the unfolding drama. His departure was meant to be swift, unnoticed. But Kevin would not allow it. "Finally, I thought I was going to have to call security to throw you out," Kevin bellowed after him, his voice thick with triumphant malice. He had clearly enjoyed his perceived victory. "And don't you dare come back here again, old man. We're decent people here. No place for vagrants." Leroy paused at the exit, his hand already on the cool metal of the door handle. He closed his eyes, striving to gather the fractured pieces of his self-control. Kevin's words were the final, crushing blow. He was no vagrant. He was a veteran, a man who had honorably served his country. He was a man who had toiled honestly his entire life, living by a strict moral code. Yet to this young man, he was merely grandpa and vagrant. He longed to turn back, to utter words that would silence Kevin, but no coherent thoughts formed. His heart ached with the profound sting of injustice. He pushed open the door and stepped out onto the street, leaving Kevin and Brittany's mocking laughter to dissipate behind him. The morning air was cool, invigorating. Yet Leroy felt nothing. He walked aimlessly, his thoughts a tangled mess. He felt broken, humiliated, utterly helpless. He couldn't fathom why people had become so cruel, so utterly indifferent. He had always clung to a belief in inherent goodness, in the fundamental decency of humanity, in the idea that every individual deserved a measure of respect. This single incident, however, threatened to shatter that deeply held conviction. He wandered for several blocks, eventually stopping at a bench in a small, unassuming park nestled amongst the towering structures of the city. The park was still largely deserted, only a handful of hurried pedestrians cutting across its paths. Leroy sank onto the bench, his head bowed. He didn't know what to do. How could he face Caleb now? What would he tell him? That he couldn't procure the pastries because he'd been summarily ejected from a cafe, branded a vagrant? He couldn't bear the thought of his grandson seeing him in such a diminished state. Weak, humiliated. Caleb had always seen him as an unyielding pillar of strength, a man who always possessed the answers, the steadfast resolve. The conversation with Kevin replayed endlessly in his mind, each cutting word, each sneering glance, a fresh wound. Leroy felt a simmering rage begin to coalesce, but he fought desperately to suppress it. Anger would achieve nothing. It would only consume him from within. He had to maintain his composure, just as his old drill sergeant, Samuel McGee, had taught him. Keep your head cool, soldier, even when all hell's breaking loose. That's how you win. But now, hell was raging within Leroy, and he felt utterly lost on how to quell the inferno. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching the city slowly awaken, filling with the cacophony of engines and hurried footsteps. The sun had climbed higher, its golden rays piercing through the thinning canopy of trees, bathing the park in a soft, ethereal light. Leroy slowly raised his head, his gaze falling upon the medal on his chest. It was tarnished, yes, but to him, it shimmered brighter than any pure gold. He recalled the day it had been bestowed upon him. He was young, vibrant, brimming with an almost naive faith in a bright future. He believed his service had not been in vain, that he had contributed meaningfully to the defense of freedom. And now, this very medal, this tangible embodiment of his life's purpose, had become a cruel jest. Suddenly, he felt a gentle touch on his shoulder. He flinched, startled, and looked up. Standing beside him was an older, robustly built man in an impeccably tailored dark blue suit. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his eyes, despite their age, were as clear and discerning as Leroy's own. On his lapel, a small, discreet eagle with outstretched wings, the distinctive insignia of a general, shimmered faintly. Leroy recognized the emblem instantly. He had worn a similar one himself, decades ago, when he was a junior officer. "Good morning," the stranger said, his voice deep and authoritative, yet surprisingly gentle. "Forgive me for intruding, but I couldn't help but notice you. You seem troubled." Leroy was taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to notice him, let alone approach him with such genuine concern. He was accustomed to navigating his burdens in solitude. "Good morning," Leroy replied, his voice a little hoarse. "It's nothing. Just a minor incident." The stranger nodded. "I understand. Sometimes those minor incidents leave the deepest scars. I've experienced it myself. My name is General Theodore Blackwood." He extended a hand. His handshake was firm, confident. Leroy shook his hand. "Leroy Jepson." He offered no rank, no embellishment. In that moment, he was simply Leroy Jepson, a humiliated old man on a park bench. "A pleasure to meet you, Leroy Jepson," Theodore smiled, a genuine warmth radiating from him. "May I join you for a few moments? I need a quiet moment to collect my thoughts before the day truly begins." Leroy nodded, still a little surprised by the unexpected attention. General Blackwood settled beside him on the bench. He asked no probing questions, offered no unsolicited advice, simply sat in a comfortable silence, as if instinctively understanding that Leroy simply needed the calming presence of another human being. It was a surprising, yet deeply comforting feeling. The silence stretched for several minutes, punctuated only by the distant hum of city life. Leroy felt a subtle shift within him. The mere presence of another veteran, a man who clearly understood the profound weight of service and honor, seemed to infuse him with a renewed sense of strength. Theodore Blackwood possessed that rare quality, a quiet gravitas that radiated calm and unwavering confidence. He made no attempt to draw Leroy into conversation, did not press for explanations, simply existed alongside him. "You know," Leroy finally ventured, breaking the comfortable quiet, "I was just at the Morning Glory Cafe. I wanted to buy some pastries for my grandson. And, well, I wasn't exactly welcomed warmly." He omitted the harsher details, unwilling to air his grievances too openly. Theodore Blackwood nodded slowly. "I know the cafe. My granddaughter is quite fond of their maple pecan pastries. I frequent it myself on occasion." He looked at Leroy, and a flicker of deep understanding passed between them. "What happened?" Leroy, unable to contain the torrent of emotions any longer, finally succumbed. All the slights, all the indignities he had endured spilled forth. He recounted the entire exchange with Kevin, the snide remarks, the cutting words, the blatant dismissal. He spoke calmly, without overt emotion, yet the pain in his voice was palpable. He sought no pity, merely presented the unvarnished facts as they had transpired. He said that times have changed, that my war stories were of no interest to anyone. He called me a vagrant. Leroy finished, his voice catching slightly. General Blackwood listened intently, his face impassive, offering no interruptions. When Leroy concluded, the general let out a slow, deliberate breath. "I am deeply sorry that you had to endure such disrespect, Leroy. That is absolutely unacceptable." He clenched his fists, and Leroy noticed the subtle clenching of his jaw. Such individuals fail to grasp the true meaning of honor, of duty, of sacrifice. They inhabit their own narrow worlds, oblivious to those who fought to secure their very right to exist within it. He looked at Leroy, and a steely glint entered his eyes. "But you know, Leroy, what truly matters isn't what such people say. It is what you know to be true about yourself. Your medal, it is not merely a piece of metal. It is a testament to your valor, your unwavering fortitude, your profound dedication. It is the very essence of your life. And no one, you hear me, no one has the right to diminish that." Leroy nodded, a profound sense of relief washing over him. The general's words were a soothing balm to his wounded spirit. He felt a surge of renewed strength. He was not alone. There were still those who understood, who cherished his service. This, in itself, was a powerful realization. "Thank you, General," Leroy said, his voice husky with emotion. "I deeply appreciate your words. It's nothing, Leroy. We, veterans, must stand together." Theodore Blackwood rose to his feet. "I believe it's time for me to go. I have a very important meeting this morning." He extended his hand to Leroy once more. "It was a true pleasure to meet you. And Leroy, never forget, your honor is your most precious possession. Never allow anyone to steal it from you." Leroy gripped his hand firmly. "I won't forget." General Blackwood departed, leaving Leroy alone on the park bench. Leroy felt undeniably better. His conversation with the general had instilled in him a renewed sense of purpose. The general was right. His honor was his most treasured possession, and he would not permit a few ignorant youngsters to strip him of it. He stood up, squared his shoulders, and his steps, once heavy with humiliation, now carried a renewed resolve. He knew precisely what he had to do. You won't believe who stood by his side. This is just the beginning. It gets even more intense. A fresh wave of resolve propelling him forward, Leroy Jebsen made his way back towards the Morning Glory Cafe. The morning breeze, now a gentle push at his back, seemed to urge him onward, while the sun, a triumphant orb above the horizon, cast long, unwavering shadows before him. The sting of humiliation had begun to recede, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning determination. General Blackwood's words, like a cool, life-giving spring, had irrigated his parched spirit, restoring its former resilience. "Your honor, your most precious possession," the general's resonant voice echoed in his mind. He understood with crystal clarity that he could not simply let the incident pass. This wasn't merely about the pastries for Caleb, though those were still important. It was about principle, about dignity, about the fundamental respect due to those who had served their nation. He recalled his fallen comrades, those who never returned from the war, remembering their unwavering belief in the ideals for which they fought. How could he possibly permit anyone to trample upon those sacred ideals? As Leroy approached Morning Glory once more, the cafe was considerably more lively. The interior now buzzed with activity. Some patrons wolfed down quick breakfasts, others engaged in hushed business discussions over steaming cups of coffee, and a few still sought refuge in the quiet corners, lost in the folds of a morning newspaper. Behind the counter, Kevin and Brittany remained, their laughter still rippling through the air, though now it was softer, absorbed by the growing hum of conversation. A smug self-satisfaction still clung to their faces, as if they were savoring the lingering taste of their morning's victory over an old man. Leroy pushed open the door and stepped inside. His gaze was direct, unwavering. He walked past several tables where people, engrossed in their smartphones, barely registered his presence. He approached the counter, where Kevin was currently demonstrating to Brittany the precise technique for arranging croissants in the display case. "Excuse me," Leroy said, his voice loud enough to be heard, yet devoid of any overt aggression. It was calm, but imbued with an undeniable inner strength. He simply waited. Kevin, turning at the sound of his voice, saw Leroy. The smug smirk that had been plastered across his face vanished, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then outright irritation. "Oh, it's you again? I told you to leave." "What else do you want, old man?" "Didn't you understand the first time?" His voice rose, drawing the attention of a few patrons who looked up from their plates. Brittany, seeing Leroy, stifled another nervous giggle, covering her mouth. But a distinct uncertainty now shadowed her amusement. "I didn't come back for pastries," Leroy replied calmly, his gaze locked firmly on Kevin's. "I came back for respect." Leroy's words caused Kevin to falter for a moment. He clearly hadn't anticipated such a direct challenge. "For respect? Ha! You, old man, you must have forgotten where you are. This is a cafe, not an army parade ground. Respect has to be earned here." He began to sneer again, his voice growing louder, more brazen. "Or do you want me to give you a medal for knowing how to walk?" Several patrons, their attention piqued by the rising tension, began to observe the unfolding drama. The woman with the laptop, who had been there earlier, finally closed her device and fixed her gaze on Leroy, then on Kevin. A flicker of something akin to condemnation crossed her features. "My medal, young man, is not a toy, nor is it a subject for your mockery," Leroy said, his voice clear, deliberate, each word enunciated with a quiet force. His voice did not waver, nor did it betray a hint of anger, only an unshakable conviction. "It is a symbol of my service in the United States Armed Forces, a symbol that I risked my life so that people like you could stand in this cafe, safely and comfortably, and hurl insults." Kevin scoffed, but a faint pallor had begun to creep onto his face. He likely hadn't expected Leroy to speak so openly, so directly, about his past. "Purple Heart? Who's going to believe you, old man? You just put on some cheap shiny thing, and now you're telling tall tales. What, do you think I'm a fool?" He forced a laugh, but it lacked its former confidence, a thin, reedy sound. Brittany, sensing Kevin losing control, nervously ran a hand through her pink hair. "I served in the 101st Airborne Division," Leroy continued, his gaze sharpening, becoming even more piercing. "In Vietnam. And this medal, it is a Purple Heart. I received it while covering the retreat of my unit, wounded in both legs. My legs still ache every single day, but I do not complain, because I know what I fought for." A collective murmur rippled through the cafe. Several patrons, upon hearing the words Vietnam and Purple Heart, slowly set down their smartphones and newspapers. A palpable sense of respect began to emanate from them. The woman with the laptop, now fully engrossed, stared intently at Leroy. Kevin, sensing his grip on the situation slipping, began to panic. "Purple Heart? As if. Who's going to believe that, old man? You're just some crazy old man. Nobody will believe you." He started to shout, attempting to drown out the growing whispers and murmurs of discontent from the patrons, who now openly regarded him with condemnation. "I am not crazy. I am a veteran," Leroy stated, raising his hand and pointing directly at the medal. "And I demand respect, not just for myself, but for every single person who has served this nation." At that precise moment, a new patron entered the cafe. He was a tall, imposing man in an impeccably tailored, expensive suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, though tired, were sharp and discerning. He was accompanied by two younger men, also in business suits, who lingered respectfully behind him. This was James Forbes, a prominent local businessman and well-known philanthropist who often frequented Morning Glory for his morning meal. He was renowned for his uncompromising nature and his utter disdain for unprofessionalism. He paused, his attention drawn by Kevin's increasingly loud outbursts, and his gaze swept over Leroy, then settled on Kevin. He immediately sensed the profound disquiet in the room. "What is going on here, Kevin?" James Forbes's voice was low, authoritative, and it immediately silenced Kevin. Forbes was one of the cafe's most valuable clients, and his opinion carried immense weight with the owner. Kevin flinched, recognizing James Forbes. His tone instantly shifted, becoming obsequious, fawning. "Mr. Forbes? Good morning, sir." "Nothing at all, sir. Just this individual here. He's disturbing our other customers." He gestured vaguely towards Leroy, attempting to deflect the blame. "This individual?" James Forbes raised an eyebrow, his gaze fixing on Leroy, then on the medal pinned to his lapel. He immediately recognized the Purple Heart. "What is he doing?" He says he's a veteran," Kevin stammered, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. "And that he has a Purple Heart. But I don't believe him. He just came in here to cause trouble." He shifted nervously on his feet. "So, he says he's a veteran, and he has a Purple Heart," James Forbes repeated, his voice even, yet infused with an unyielding steel. He took a deliberate step forward, moving closer to Leroy. "May I see your medal, sir?" he asked Leroy, his voice laced with genuine respect. Leroy silently unbuttoned his blazer and displayed the medal. James Forbes examined it carefully, then nodded. "A Purple Heart," he stated, his voice quiet, yet resonant. "Genuine. That is a very serious honor, sir. For what did you receive it?" Leroy, finding new strength in the sudden shift of atmosphere, retold his story, this time with greater confidence. He spoke of Vietnam, of his unit, of the wounding, of covering his comrades' retreat. His voice remained calm, but it conveyed a profound sense of both pain and pride. The assembled patrons listened, holding their breath. A profound silence descended upon the cafe. James Forbes listened without interruption. When Leroy finished, Forbes turned to Kevin, his eyes blazing with incandescent anger. "And you, Kevin, you dared to call this man a liar? You dared to mock his honor? You dared to brand him a vagrant and eject him from your establishment?" His voice, though quiet, resonated with the force of thunder. "Do you comprehend with whom you are speaking?" Kevin visibly recoiled beneath Forbes's searing gaze. He attempted to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Brittany, standing beside him, stared wide-eyed at James Forbes, her face ashen. She had clearly never witnessed her manager in such a state of abject terror. "This man, Kevin, is a hero," James Forbes declared, each word a hammer blow. "He risked his life for our country. He shed his blood so that you could stand here and sell your pastries, if you even had any. And you conduct yourself like an ignorant, uncultured lout." The patrons, who had been silently observing, nodded in agreement. Some began to whisper amongst themselves, their condemnation of Kevin's behavior palpable. The tension in the cafe had reached a boiling point. It felt as though something unpredictable, monumental was about to transpire. I didn't know, sir. I thought he—" Kevin stammered, attempting to offer a feeble justification, but James Forbes's voice cut him off, sharp and decisive. "You didn't know? And why did you not inquire? Why did you immediately resort to insulting a man significantly older than yourself, a man who unequivocally deserves respect? Were you not taught common courtesy? Were you not taught to honor your elders? Were you not taught to revere those who secured your very freedom?" James Forbes spoke rapidly, his voice brimming with indignation. "Is this the standard of service at Morning Glory? I believe the owner will find this extremely interesting." Kevin's face turned an ashen gray. James Forbes's thinly veiled threat was gravely serious. The cafe's owner, Mr. Patrick O'Malley, was exceptionally sensitive to the opinions of his loyal clientele, especially those as influential as Forbes. Kevin understood, with a sickening clarity, that his career at Morning Glory, and quite possibly within the entire service industry, was now hanging by the thinnest of threads. He nervously rubbed his hands together, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "I apologize, Mr. Forbes. I was wrong," Kevin stammered, his voice barely audible, a pathetic whimper. I apologize to you, sir." He turned to Leroy, his face a contorted mask of fear and profound humiliation. I sincerely apologize, sir. I was wrong. I never should have spoken that way." Leroy looked at him. He saw the raw fear in Kevin's eyes, the abject humiliation. For a fleeting moment, he felt a flicker of pity. He had never sought to humiliate anyone, not even those who had sought to humiliate him. His sole objective was the restoration of justice, not the pursuit of vengeance. "Apology accepted," Leroy said calmly. "But remember this, respect is not something you demand. It is something you give, and to those who serve this country, it should be given as a default, without question." James Forbes nodded in approval. "Very well said, sir." He turned back to Kevin. "Kevin, I believe you should take some time to reflect on your behavior, and on what it truly means to work with people. For now, I think you can take a break. I will personally speak with Mr. O'Malley." Kevin, pale and trembling, nodded. He knew precisely what that meant. He was fired. He silently unpinned his name tag and dropped it onto the counter. Brittany, witnessing his abject surrender, quickly snatched up the name tag and began to meticulously wipe down the counter, pointedly avoiding eye contact with Kevin. "And now, sir." James Forbes turned to Leroy, a gentle smile replacing his stern expression. "Do not let this unfortunate incident spoil your morning. Allow me to invite you to breakfast. And I believe Morning Glory owes you those maple pecan pastries, even if, as our former employee claimed, they are no longer available." He cast a meaningful glance at Brittany. Brittany, understanding the unspoken implication, nervously swallowed. They might be in the back, sir. I'll go look." She vanished through the kitchen door, only to reappear moments later with a large box, overflowing with warm, freshly baked maple pecan pastries. Their intoxicating aroma wafted through the cafe, a sweet, T.I.